The neighbors on Sycamore Crest had a lot of opinions about Norbert Quinn. They said he was strange. They said the war had done something to him that couldn't be undone. They said a man his age, 64, retired from 22 years in the United States Army, should be sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, not hauling timber and digging trenches in his backyard like the ground owed him something. What they didn't say, at least not to his face, was that they were also a little afraid of him. Norbert didn't mind. He had stopped needing people to understand him somewhere around Kandahar, 2003. He had the dog, anyway. Biscuit was a 7-year-old golden retriever, with one chewed ear, and the kind of patience that made people think she was half-saint. She'd come to him through a rescue out of Barry, a veterans program. The kind where the paperwork took 3 months, and the home visit felt like a background check for a government job. Norbert had passed. Biscuit had climbed into the passenger seat of his truck on the day he picked her up and hadn't really left his side since. They lived in a small house at the end of Sycamore Crest, in the kind of town that sits just north of Georgian Bay, where the winters are long and the summers are short, and everyone knows what your truck looks like before they know your name. The town was called Millhaven Crossing, and it had the particular quality of small Ontario towns, where people were friendly in the summer and suspicious in the winter, and somewhere in between the rest of the time. Norbert had moved there 4 years ago, after the divorce, after the physiotherapy, after the long gray months in a veteran's apartment in Hamilton, where the walls were thin and the hallways smelled like someone else's dinner. A friend had told him about the property, a modest 2-bedroom on a half-acre lot, backing up to a stand of white pine that ran all the way down to a frozen creek. It needed work. Norbert had bought it with what was left of his settlement and his pension, and had started working on it the following spring. He fixed the roof first, then the foundation drainage. Then he split 3 cords of wood and stacked them along the side of the house. That was when the comments started. His immediate neighbor, a retired school principal named Gerald Petch, leaned over the fence one September afternoon and asked if Norbert was planning to open a campground. 3 cords is a lot of wood, Gerald said, not unkindly. It's a cold part of the province, Norbert said. We've got baseboard heating on this street. I know. Gerald waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. He went back inside. The following spring, Norbert started on the structure. He spent 2 weeks sketching it out at the kitchen table with graph paper and a mechanical pencil, Biscuit asleep under the chair. He had learned basic engineering principles in the Army. Not formally, but practically. The kind of knowledge that comes from watching things get built and watching them fail. From understanding load and drainage and airflow, not as theory, but as consequences. He drew a covered woodshed that would wrap around 3 sides of the house, like an arm around a shoulder. Not attached to the structure, separate, raised on posts, with a corrugated steel roof and open sides on the south face to let the air through. It would keep the wood dry. It would keep it accessible. It would hold, by his estimate, about 14 cords. Before we go any further, where are you watching from today? Drop your city or town in the comments. It's always good to know who's out there. Norbert ordered the lumber in May. It arrived on 2 flatbeds and sat in his driveway for a week before he started cutting. He worked in the mornings, mostly when the light was best and the air was still cool. Biscuit would lie in the grass and watch him with that particular golden retriever expression that looked like concern, but was probably just attention. The neighbors watched too, from windows and driveways and over the tops of fences. By June, the posts were in. By July, the frame was up. By late August, when the roof was on, and Norbert had started filling the bays with split ash and maple, 3 things had happened. The structure had begun to look genuinely impressive. The rumors had gotten louder, and Gerald Petch had stopped leaning over the fence. It was Gerald's wife, Sandra, who started the group chat. Norbert didn't know this at the time. He learned it later, from a woman named June Adler who lived 2 doors down and had the decency to feel guilty about it. The chat was called something harmless, a neighborhood check-in thing, but the conversation had drifted. Someone said Norbert was building a bunker. Someone said he was a prepper. Someone used the phrase, "not right in the head," and nobody pushed back on it. A man named Doug Renner, who had moved to Sycamore Crest from Mississauga 3 years prior, and had very strong opinions about property aesthetics, called the town planning office to ask about permit requirements for accessory structures. The planning office called Norbert. Norbert sent them his drawings, his measurements, his materials list. Everything was within code. The planning office called Doug Renner back and told him so. Doug Renner did not take this news graciously. He started parking his car at the end of his driveway, so he wouldn't have to look at Norbert's property. When he backed out in the morning, he mentioned, at a fall block party, Norbert did not attend, that the neighborhood was changing. He said it in that way people say things when they mean something specific, but want plausible deniability about what they mean. Norbert finished the structure in October, 14.5 cords, fully covered, split and stacked with the precision of a man who had once arranged supply depots in places where a misplaced pallet could mean people went without. He stood back and looked at it on a Sunday afternoon, Biscuit beside him, the autumn light catching the grain of the stacked maple, and he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Satisfied, maybe. Or something quieter than that. "What do you think?" he said to Biscuit. Biscuit wagged twice and pressed her nose against his hand. He took that as approval. The winter started normally. November brought the usual gray, December the usual freeze. The baseboard heaters in the houses on Sycamore Crest clicked on, and the hydro bills went up, and people complained about hydro rates. The way people in Ontario have complained about hydro rates for as long as anyone can remember. Norbert's house stayed warm. He kept the wood stove he'd installed in the living room, burning low through the nights, the smell of wood smoke drifting out through the chimney and across the snow. January was when things changed. It started with the ice storm. The forecast called for mixed precipitation over the weekend. Nothing catastrophic, the kind of thing the Weather Service issues an advisory for, and most people shrug off. Norbert watched the sky on the Thursday before and felt something shift in the air, some quality of pressure and cold and stillness that he had learned to pay attention to over the years. Not in Ontario, before Ontario. In other places where the weather had consequences. He brought in an extra week's worth of wood on Friday. He filled the water jugs he kept in the basement. He checked the generator. Biscuit watched him work with her ears slightly raised, tracking each task with the quiet attentiveness of an animal that had learned his routines and knew when they changed. The storm hit Saturday evening. By midnight, Millhaven Crossing had 4 centimeters of ice on every surface. By Sunday morning, it had 7. The power went out at 3:47 a.m. Norbert noted the time from habit, the way soldiers note things. And the silence that followed was enormous and total. The kind that comes when every furnace and refrigerator and clock in a neighborhood stops at once. He fed more wood into the stove. Biscuit moved closer to it and settled in. On Sunday afternoon, Norbert put on his coat and went outside to check the roof load. The ice was extraordinary. A full glazing over every branch and wire and surface, catching the low winter light and throwing it in every direction. The power lines along Sycamore Crest sagged badly. 2 had already come down at the far end of the street, their poles leaning at angles that made them look like tired men. He walked the perimeter of his structure. The roof was holding. He went back inside. By Sunday evening, the calls started going around the neighborhood. Not on the group chat, which was useless without power, but by foot. People knocking on doors. People comparing notes. The hydro company's emergency line said, repairs could take 48 to 72 hours, possibly longer depending on damage assessment. The temperature was forecast to drop to -22 overnight. Gerald Petch knocked on Norbert's door at 6 o'clock. He looked different than Norbert was used to seeing him, smaller, somehow. His coat wasn't quite right for the temperature, a fall jacket instead of a real winter parka, and his hands were shaking slightly, though whether from cold or something else Norbert couldn't say. "The heat's been out since before 4 this morning," Gerald said. "I know. Sandra has a heart condition. The doctor says she needs to stay warm." Norbert stepped back from the door. "Come in." Gerald came in. Biscuit walked over and sat in front of him, and Gerald put his hand on her head automatically, the way people do when they need something to hold on to. "The house is already down to 14 degrees, Gerald said. "It'll keep dropping. How many blankets do you have?" "Not enough. Our electric blanket is useless without power, obviously." Norbert went to the closet and came back with 2 wool blankets, the heavy kind military surplus. He handed them to Gerald. "These'll help for tonight. But if it goes past 72 hours, which it might, you and Sandra should come here." Gerald looked at him for a moment. Something moved across his face that was hard to name. Relief and something harder. Something that cost him more to feel. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't worry about it," Norbert said. He was already thinking about the other houses. He went to June Adler's first, because she lived alone, and he thought she probably hadn't told anyone she was struggling. He was right. She opened the door with a candle in her hand, and a look of carefully maintained composure that broke slightly when she saw it was him. "I was going to manage," she said. "I know," Norbert said, "but you don't have to." He gave her the number of the neighbor 2 streets over who had a gas fireplace and had already called to offer space. He offered to walk her there if she needed it. She said she'd call first. He nodded and moved on. He went to 3 other houses after that. A young couple with a 6-month-old infant who had no idea what to do and were clearly too cold and too frightened to think clearly. An older man named Albert, who was 91 years old and had been a machinist and refused to ask anyone for anything, ever, as a point of personal philosophy, and who accepted Norbert's offer of firewood not as charity but as a trade, insisting on giving Norbert a jar of pickled beets in return. A single mother named Cheryl, who had 2 kids under 10, and whose first question was not, "Can you help me?" but "Do you know who else needs help?" A question that Norbert appreciated more than he could easily say. He did not go to Doug Renner's house, not because he hadn't thought about it. He'd stood at the end of the Renner driveway for a moment in the dark, and the cold Biscuit sitting beside him in the snow, and he had weighed things, what he'd heard, what he knew, what it cost and what it meant. Then he walked up the driveway and knocked. Doug Renner opened the door in a bathrobe. His face did something complicated when he saw who it was. He'd been in the process of, it seemed, trying to figure out if the gas fireplace in his living room could be made to work without the electronic igniter, and not succeeding. "I can show you how to light it manually," Norbert said. "If you want." Doug Renner stared at him. "You'll need a long lighter or a match," Norbert said. "Do you have either?" "Yes, I think so." "Okay." Norbert came in. Biscuit waited at the door, which was the rule in other people's houses, unless they invited her. And Norbert found the fireplace and found the pilot valve, and walked Doug through the sequence. The fireplace caught on the second try, the blue flame spreading to the ceramic logs with a sound like a breath. Doug Renner stood there looking at it. "Thank you," he said finally. It came out rough, like a word he hadn't used in a while. "There's wood at my place if you need it," Norbert said. "Open access. Don't knock. Just come." He walked home through the ice, Biscuit beside him, the street quiet and glittering. The power came back on Wednesday morning, 69 hours after it went out. In that time, 7 households from Sycamore Crest had come to Norbert's woodshed. They had taken what they needed. Some of them had stacked whatever they took, restoring the pile as best they could. Some had left small things, a tin of shortbread, a bag of clementines, a handwritten note that said, "Only thank you," in careful block letters. Norbert found these things in the morning when he went out to check the structure, and he set them aside and didn't say anything about them to anyone. Albert, the 91-year-old machinist, came by on Thursday afternoon to return the wool blankets and to bring a second jar of pickled beets, which he presented with the air of a man. settling a debt with considerable satisfaction. You planned for this, Albert said, looking at the woodshed. I planned for something, Norbert said. Albert considered this. Smart, habit, same thing at a certain age. Albert left. Norbert stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the structure. Some of the bays were emptier now than they had been. He'd need to spend March splitting next year's supply. He was already looking forward to it. June Adler stopped by on Friday. She was carrying a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil and a look of determination. I want to apologize, she said. Norbert waited. I was part of that group chat, she said, in the fall. When people were saying things about your project, I didn't say anything to stop it, and I should have. Norbert was quiet for a moment. I appreciate you saying that. I didn't know what you were doing, June said. I mean, I could see you were building something, but I didn't understand why. Most people don't think much about winter until it's already on top of them, he said. June looked at the woodshed, at the stacked rows of maple and ash, at the precise geometry of it, the careful overhang of the roof, the way the structure protected the wood from every angle of weather. You weren't building it for yourself, were you? She said. Not quite a question. Norbert didn't answer right away. He looked out at the white pine at the back of the property, at the snow on the branches, at Biscuit doing her slow circuit of the yard, nose down, following whatever trail the morning had left on the cold ground. I didn't know who it was for, he said finally. I just knew I should build it. June nodded as if this made perfect sense, which to her credit it seemed to. Gerald Petch came by on Saturday. He brought Sandra, who was small and white-haired and walked with a cane, and who thanked Norbert with the particular directness of someone who has been cold and frightened and is now warm and not frightened, and wants to be absolutely clear about the difference. Our house got down to 9 degrees, she told him. 9. I've never been so cold in my life. I'm glad you came over, Norbert said. I told Gerald months ago that shed of yours must be for something sensible, Sandra said. Men don't build things for no reason. Gerald, to his credit, did not dispute this reconstruction of events. He did shake Norbert's hand. A long handshake, the kind that says things the words around it don't quite manage. Norbert shook it back. Spring came slowly that year, the way it does in that part of Ontario, grudgingly and in stages. March brought mud. April brought the first real thaw, and then a late snowstorm that caught everyone off guard except Norbert, who had watched the sky again and brought in extra wood again, and who was not surprised. The neighborhood had shifted in ways that were hard to articulate but easy to feel. People waved. People stopped in the driveway for 5 minutes to talk about nothing in particular, which is the way you talk to someone you've decided to trust. Doug Renner had removed his car from the end of his driveway. He hadn't apologized, exactly. Norbert didn't expect it, and wouldn't have known what to do with it if it came. But he'd started including Norbert in the street-level hello that neighbors exchange when they're outside at the same time, and that was something. June Adler organized a street cleanup in May. Norbert showed up with a rake and Biscuit, who was largely unhelpful but very popular. On a Saturday afternoon in June, Norbert sat on his back steps with a cup of coffee and looked at the woodshed. He was already planning next year's supply. He'd need to order another cord or two of ash to replace what had gone out in January, and he was thinking about whether the south-facing bays could use a bit more overhang on the roof. Small adjustments. The kind you make when something is working and you want it to keep working. Biscuit came and sat beside him, pressing her flank against his leg. The pines moved in the warm wind. The creek at the back of the property was running high and clear, the way it did in June before the summer heat came. Somewhere on the street, a lawnmower started. Norbert finished his coffee. He thought about the places he had been, and the things he had learned there about preparation and cost, and what it means to be ready for something that most people don't want to think about until it happens. He thought about the people he had served with, the ones still here and the ones not, and what any of them would have said about a man who built a woodshed in a suburb north of Georgian Bay. and managed to keep 7 families warm through a 3-day ice storm. He thought they would have understood. He thought they would have built one too. Biscuit sighed contentedly beside him, her golden ear twitching at something in the grass. The neighbors had stopped laughing a long time ago. Not because anything dramatic had happened. No confrontation, no public reckoning, no moment of declared understanding. Just a winter, and a man who had prepared for it, and a dog that had sat beside him through every hour of the work. Some things don't need a ceremony to be true. Some promises don't need to be spoken to be kept. Norbert set down his empty cup and scratched Biscuit behind the ear, and the afternoon opened around them, like something given, like something earned, and there was nothing more that needed to be said.